Thank you very much for coming to watch this talk on training instructional coaches. Normally, when I do presentations and things, they're heavily drawn from evidence. And this is definitely based on some evidence, but it's mainly my experience over quite a few years. So I'll try to go for a reasonable pace of kind of overview of how I have trained coaches reasonably successfully in the past. And if you want to kind of get into any nitty-gritty bits over lunch, please come and grab me or Yuvraj and have a chat about how we do anything specific. So just to say, my experience with instructional coaching started when I worked as a teacher educator for Teach First. And I think we're all reasonably familiar with Teach First, but Teach First train teachers new to the profession, and usually they go into quite challenging environments. So they move to a model of instructional coaching, because instructional coaching is a great way to get teachers to practice techniques in the classroom, particularly behavioural management techniques that will serve trainees quite well in schools that are often quite challenging environments. I then went to work at Ambition Institute, have some colleagues here as well. I'm a little bit nervous about presenting in front of them. But we worked on a programme for early career teachers, which was driven by Kyle Bailey, who is also here today and who is presenting. And he had a vision for instructional coaching for all early career teachers. And it's been a really interesting and challenging programme to work on, and we focused a lot of our time on training mentors, so that's another kind of piece of the puzzle. And then I have the absolute pleasure to work with Yuvraj this year, where he is starting his school off on their instructional coaching journey, and it's my job to support him to train his coaches. Coaches are situated within the school environment. You can train your coaches and be really confident that they know their stuff, but they are operating within this environment. If you don't lay the foundations properly for your coaches to be able to coach and for coaching to be able to take hold in your school, then coaching is not going to thrive. It's just going to fail. So I'm going to talk about this little purple splodge here for the first half of the session, and then Yuvraj is going to talk to you about the conditions in the school that need to be in place to implement instructional coaching. So here's what we'll cover. Nice and simple. I'll try and get you out to lunch on time. So to start with, what do coaches need to know? When I started training coaches, I realised the first thing, the foundation of what they needed to know was how people learn. And I use the word people because it serves this really nice kind of, I was about to say dual purpose, but it's actually kind of a triumvirate, triple purpose, whatever you call it, sorry math teachers. They learn how pupils learn. The same principles apply to how teachers learn, or very similar, and it helps them understand how they will learn to be coaches. So I will go through this a little bit more detail later in the presentation, but essentially we need a shared model of how people learn. The model that a lot of people choose, the model that I've chosen in the past, has been Daniel Willingham's simple model of memory, to give us a shared understanding of how memory works and therefore how learning works. And that's usually what I will share and talk about in the first session with coaches. I think Yuvraj will agree that it's a bit of a sort of penny drop moment for a lot of coaches, and it really gets them quite excited about the programme that you're going to do with them. So in that way, it's quite a cool start to the programme as well. The next thing I tend to do is to work with them on understanding something that I'm going to call learning problems. Now, I don't mean problem in a negative way. I mean problem in a, we've all got the shared set of problems as teachers that we are working on all of the time. I've written a blog about this, From Answers to Problems. And the idea behind that is that coaches need to see their role. And their role is not to go into a classroom and create a mini-me. It's not to go in and say, I teach like this, therefore you should teach like this. Their job is to go into a classroom and almost see the deep structure of what is going on in that classroom and to see what learning problems the teacher is facing and which one they might need help with to try to tackle. So what do I mean by learning problems? What are these learning problems? You could see them as common problems that all teachers are trying to solve all the time. And Kennedy sets these out in a really nice paper called Parsing the Practice of Teaching, which I recommend to have a read of, Parsing the Practice of Teaching, where she lays out these different problems that all teachers are always striving for. So one of them she calls portraying curriculum. All teachers are trying to work out how best to portray the curriculum to their students. You'd be lying if you said you'd nailed it. You haven't. Another one is enlisting participation. We're always trying to get pupils to kind of be involved, be thinking hard about stuff. So that's another problem. You want coaches to really understand what those problems are and to be able to go into a lesson and see which problems the teacher's working on and doing well at and which problems they need a bit of support with. I like to call it like, you know in The Matrix when Neo can finally see the Matrix at the end and then like he can defeat I can't remember what the bad guy, Agent Smith or whatever his name was, right? That's almost what you want for your coaches. They need to step in, they need to see the classroom differently from how your kind of average teacher would walk into different classrooms. So that's what I'm calling learning problems. That's how you want to focus it. There's also another really cool benefit to learning problems. If we're saying that all teachers are working on really challenging problems all of the time, then it's not about the teacher being a rubbish teacher and that's why they need coaching. It's about, hang on a second, we're all trying to problem solve these things all of the time and we will never solve them. So your feedback that you're giving them is about, not because they're a bad teacher, it's because they're a teacher that they're getting that feedback. And it takes the sting a bit out of professional development. It's a nice way for any leaders in here who are kicking off instructional coaching or working on instructional coaching, wherever you are in your journey, it's a good way, I think, of framing instructional coaching. So the next thing they need is they need knowledge of effective pedagogy. When they coach teachers, they need to be able to offer solutions to these learning problems. If they don't have a repertoire of effective pedagogy, and if that isn't agreed upon around the school, and if there isn't a shared language about this effective pedagogy, then instructional coaching is not really going to take hold. So we need to have this shared language and reasonable agreement about what this effective pedagogy is. But also, coaches need to be able to break it down and communicate it. A lot of coaches that we pick to be instructional coaches is because they're really good teachers. But what's the issue with that? Well, really good teachers have often automated their schema and their skills around teaching. So if I sit down, Yuvraj, who's a fantastic teacher, and ask him how he preempts behaviour in his classroom, he might really struggle to verbalise how he does it. It's so fluid for him. So if you want to train your coaches, you're going to have to face up to the fact that even really good teachers are going to need loads of support with breaking down what they know. I don't work for Steplab, but I think Steplab is a fantastic way of doing that because it brings to the surface and verbalises those different actions that teachers take. Obviously, your coaches need to have a really good grasp of the coaching model that you're using as well. And they need to be able to understand how challenging it is to be coached. Therefore, I would say your coaches have no business coaching unless they are being coached themselves. So you must be being coached if you are going to be a coach. You just have so much more empathy for the process. You're so much more aware of where you need to scaffold and various other things. So make sure your coaches are being coached. Usually a nice low stakes way of doing that is the coaches coach each other. That's what Yuvraj and I are going to be working on next half term. They need that grasp of the coaching model and they need lots of practice using it as well. If they practice using it a lot, they'll be able to be flexible about how they use it as well. Because you may want to be more directive with some teachers and you may need to be more facilitative with other teachers, depending on their expertise in the area you're coaching them on and their confidence, self-efficacy, that kind of thing. And then you've got your great coach at the top. There they are. So those are the kind of areas I think we need to focus on. But we've got a bit of an issue. And the issue that we need to hold in our minds when we're training coaches is the nature of expertise. The first thing we need to realise is that expertise is domain specific. So your coaches might feel quite confident coaching in one particular area, like behaviour management, but if they have to coach on assessment techniques, they might find that really challenging. So expertise is domain specific. It's usually tied to a particular area that we feel quite expert in. Now, that kind of means that it's hard for coaches to be expert in the entirety of teaching. Teaching is massive. It covers lots of subjects, lots of domains. So your coach is probably not going to be an expert in every single domain. That's okay. I think, this is my view, is that you want coaches who have a really good grasp of pedagogy in lots of different areas as much as possible, but who also realise that it's their job to work with the teacher to implement whatever action step it is that you're working on. So what I mean by that is that I think we want coaches to go into classrooms and construct a hypothesis of what they think is going on. So to come into a classroom, to see that deep structure and go, I think the learning problem that this teacher is working on is this. I think that possible solutions could be this, this and this. Right, that's from their expertise. But they hold that lightly. They are not an expert in teaching that particular class most of the time. They may not even have subject expertise with that particular subject. So I think that they should create hypotheses about what they think is going on, and they should communicate tentatively. They should offer concrete solutions, but they should be aware that it may not work perfectly for that teacher and incorporate that teacher's expertise as well. The second thing we want to recognise about expertise, I've already touched on, which is this idea of the curse of knowledge, sometimes called the curse of expertise. And what that means, and this is borne out, I think, through cognitive science, neuroscience, is that when you get good at something, you automate it. So if you get good at a skill, your neurons connect up, you get your nice myelin going across them, and things happen really, really quickly. You find it hard to then break down the skill. Same with knowledge. When I'm talking about semantic knowledge, so your kind of knowledge of how to do planning and things like that, you get these like rich structures in your head where you don't need to sit and plan for hours anymore. You could almost rock up to the classroom and teach an awesome lesson off the top of your head. And that's because you've got this rich schema where things you see in the environment are kind of cueing you to do things, and you can do it really fluidly. So if I sat down with an expert maths teacher and I said, like, how do you plan a lesson? They might be like, well, what's the lesson on? Oh, well, I'd just do this, this and this. That's not helpful for a novice. they need to be able to break it down. So you have to work with your coaches really carefully on breaking down the great stuff that they do, because they are probably suffering from the curse of knowledge or the curse of expertise. And the curse of expertise means you cannot see things from a novice or a more novice perspective. And that's the whole point of coaching. You have to be able to see it from that more novice perspective. So, what do we actually do when we train coaches? So I'm going to talk about what I've been working with Yuvraj on and what I've done in the past. We have to think about training coaches the same way we think about teaching pupils. So we have to create a curriculum of training for them. Have a look at some of the sessions that I might run. I'll go into a little bit more detail on a couple of these in a moment. But essentially, as I said, like that foundational piece about how people learn is really crucial. We want them to be able to see the matrix. We want them to be able to go in and see the learning problems. So we do a lot on diagnosis. And within that, we talk about cognitive bias, because you can quite easily walk into someone's classroom and have all these like biases about what you like in a teacher. It's not about what you like. It's about effective teaching and solving those learning problems. We then delve into some tricky aspects of the coaching model. So we talk about modelling. Even though teachers are generally really good at modelling, for some reason, as soon as they become coaches and it's in front of an adult, it can feel very different. So we talk a lot about how to model, how to break things down. So we've got that pedagogy and that breaking down piece in there. And we do a piece on deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is a bit controversial. Can you do it in teaching? Can you not? We won't go into that today. But essentially, that is hard to run with another adult. It can feel really awkward and horrible. And that's where kind of your school and how your school set it up can kind of support you. But there are things you can do within a deliberate practice session to make things easier. I'll go into those a little bit later. And then we might do some stuff on responsive coaching. So that's being able to flex the coaching model and flex the way you use your questions and things like that to really make sure that you are respecting the expertise of the teacher and building on their prior knowledge and all that good stuff. But we also, in many schools, need to make sure we run pedagogy throughout that, making sure they understand what techniques can we use to effectively assess pupils. How can we deliver clear explanations in whatever subject? We need pedagogy to run through these sessions. So we'll talk about techniques. We'll talk about different scenarios in teaching. And we will weave that in to our curriculum. And what does that look like in terms of a rhythm of input? So I'm working with Yuvraj at the moment, and I've worked and done this for Ambition as well, Institute. And I think that this kind of works quite well if you're going to deliver a programme of inputs. And the time scale for this will depend on where your school is. If your school is very much at the beginning, you don't have a shared understanding of teaching, you're not there yet, then this will take years. This is a commitment over years and years, and it should take years. If you are further along than that, you've got a shared language, you know what effective pedagogy is, you've normed that, you're starting to use these techniques and things like that. This may be slightly shorter as a time frame. But here's how I might do it. I kick off a session, so usually a full day kind of session where we will do something like how people learn, for example, or deliberate practice, wherever we are in our sessions. Then you have a gap between sessions, a nice big gap, like I'm talking like a 6-week gap, where they will be set reading to do to build their understanding of what they're doing. They will be given some kind of practice task. At first, it won't be go out and coach because they're not ready. At first, it will just be like implement something you've learned from the session. So in a how people learn session, they might go away, script an explanation of how people learn and deliver it to somebody to practice it, a colleague that they trust perhaps. Nothing too high stakes. We'll also factor in some sense making. All this reading could just be completely misunderstood. We need to make sure that our coaches are understanding the stuff we're kind of giving them and not getting too overloaded. So a sense-making session, after school, lunchtime for an hour, can be really useful. And then guess what? We do it all again with the next session. These things change. Different reading depending on the topic, different practice tasks depending on what we need them to do. And this will kind of continue throughout the school year. So that's my rhythm of inputs. Let's delve into a couple of training sessions. So to start with, I would always kick off with how people learn. What do I talk about in that session? What's the overview of that? Talk about expertise development. How do we develop the expertise of our coaches? How do we develop the expertise of our teachers? How do pupils develop their expertise? That's how we learn on those 3 levels. And I tend to talk about it in terms of mental models or schema, which have become kind of big words that we use now, which is good. So we talk about kind of making sure that knowledge is there before we get someone to use it and start to do things and practice with it. So we talk about that development of expertise, and it also helps to build their metacognition. How expert are you at certain things as well? So we always turn it back on the coaches to be thinking about their own expertise. We also use a model of memory because we need a shared understanding of how memory and learning works. I choose to use Daniel Willingham's simple model of memory because I think it's really useful, but I like to infuse it with a bit of neuroscience as well to make it less simple and more challenging. A challenging model of memory, you might say. So then you've kind of got this shared understanding of how people learn. Our coaches were really enthused by this, I think, and went along with it and were kind of happy with it. And then they went and did the reading. And then suddenly they had about 1 million questions. And I remember session 2, they came back with loads of questions. So that reading piece is really key to getting them to understand what they do and don't feel comfortable with, because for a lot of people this is quite a big change. What about the deliberate practice sessions? That comes a little bit later. This is a tricky session. It's a really interesting session, but it's a tricky session. Remember that I said that how people learn flows through the whole programme. That's so important. So when you get to deliberate practice, it becomes easy to link it to the idea that deliberate practice helps move things from your working memory to your long-term memory. So you always want to be linking it back to the science of learning. We also talk about, I don't know if you can see that at the back, sorry, should have made that way bigger. Anders Ericsson talks about this idea that we can go into this phase of arrested development. So that's the kind of plateauing phase. When we get kind of quite good at something, we don't get any better at it if we don't work at it, we just kind of stay about the same, like driving, for instance. And that can happen in teaching as well. We get to a certain point and we're kind of comfortable, and that's where we stay. In order to kind of emerge from this arrested development phase, like a butterfly, what we want to do is we want to focus in on certain little things and deliberately practice them to kind of burst out of that arrested development phase. We talk about the why. We make sure they understand why deliberate practice is important. Because when they feel really uncomfortable doing it, they need the why. They need to fall back on the why, otherwise they won't do it. So we need to talk a lot about the why. And part of that why is that teaching is particularly conducive to forming habits. There's been some research on this by Sims, Hobbs and Allen, that teaching, because of quite how stressful it is and how there's lots of things going on, teachers form habits. And they can get into this arrested development stage quite easily. And therefore, to kind of try to build their mental models and to change their habits, we want to use something like deliberate practice. So always kind of starting with the why. But how do we get coaches to think about running deliberate practice? So deliberate practice being obviously where they're trying to get the coachee to actually get up and practice the skill or to practice the thought process. We must talk to our coaches and train them on how to scaffold deliberate practice for the person in front of them. They can assume that they're asking them to practice something very small and easy. But if you've ever done deliberate practice, you'll know that you're sitting there and you're like, oh God, this person I really respect is going to see me do something really awful and fall flat on my arse, and I'm going to feel really stupid. And the cognitive load of that just means you actually can't even remember the simple instruction you were supposed to read out during the deliberate practice. So I would always say to coaches, if in doubt, err on the side of more scaffolding. So what do I mean by scaffolding? When you are doing deliberate practice with somebody, let them read things out from their script to start with. Let them have all the stuff in front of them if they're modelling their thought process, if they're practicing their thought process. Let them have it all in front of them. So when their working memory becomes overloaded, it's all there and they don't feel like they've fallen flat on their arse. So that's one way of scaffolding. Another way, if it's a performance action step and they're going to get up and deliver something, let them do it sitting down first. Because then they get to hear how their voice sounds doing it, and they get to muddle with their words a bit and get it right, and then get up and get their body positioning right. So let them do it sitting down first. Another way we can scaffold deliberate practice is by doing it in small chunks. So we might practice the first bit of the action step first, to the very point where if you're doing with like a nervous ECT, for example, if the action step is to practice delivering an instruction from a place that's visible in the room, you might get them just to stand in the visible spot to start with. Great, you've managed to do that bit. That's fantastic. Let's try out the next bit. And then we add it on and we layer it, just like we would with pupils, breaking it down and then building it up. So we can scaffold deliberate practice in that way. The neat thing about Steplab is that it's got the action step and success criteria available to you as well. And that helps to scaffold things for you as a coach and for your teacher as well. The other point of deliberate practice is feedback. Feedback is tricky at any point, but it's particularly tricky when it's like you're giving feedback to someone on their performance as a teacher. It feels very personal. We build our kind of self-concepts around like how we are as a teacher and how we teach. So we have to work with coaches very carefully on giving feedback and how to do it. And one thing to recognise that we must talk to teachers about is that, and Ollie Cav actually just talked about this in his session, is that feedback happens in the mind of the person getting the feedback. So it is really important how you give it, yes, but you have to check that it's been understood as well. And that's why deliberate practice is really neat, because you give the feedback and then they re-practice. So if they didn't understand what you said, you'll very soon know. So you mustn't miss out that re-practice element, because that's you checking that the feedback has happened the way you wanted it to in the mind of the person getting the feedback. I'm going to whiz on because I want Yuvraj to have at least 5 minutes to do his bit. I don't need 5 minutes. He's a reluctant presenter, but thank you anyway for doing it, Yuvraj. All right, I'll talk to you about one more thing then about feedback. Two types of feedback that we use. One is called just-in-time feedback. So when someone is practicing their action step, you will contract with them that you are allowed to pause them in the middle of their practice. You're allowed to interrupt them, which socially is not usually okay, but you contract with them that you're allowed to do it. You can press pause on what they're doing and give them a tiny bit of feedback to nudge them in the right direction, and then they do that bit again. So let's say I'm coaching someone who they're practicing delivering instructions from the front of the room, and I notice that their body language isn't right. As soon as they start delivering the instruction, I might just go, stop. You need to be standing up straight, remember body language, try that again, and then they re-practice straight away. So that's just-in-time feedback. And then there's the end of the round feedback. So once they've practiced that whole round, then you might give them some reinforcing and some other feedback, and then they re-practice the whole thing again. So just-in-time feedback and between rounds feedback is what I tend to talk to coaches about.